welcome, should welcome my ex-colleague, Gary Hickey, who used to work in the RDS Southeast, although he still has a small role there, which I'm very pleased about. But over to Gary, who was our public involvement co-production expert and still is an expert on this. And very welcome you to speak here.
Thank you, Jorgen. Hi, everyone. While I'm sharing my slides, I'm going to do this presentation along with my colleague, Julie Wright. So Julie, whilst I mess around with the slides, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you, Gary. Yeah, so I'm a lay member with the Research and Design Service Southeast. Gary was my boss until very recently. I was very impressed with his emphasis on co-production and have really appreciated his involvement of me in a lot more sort of projects since he joined. Doing some presentations with him being one of them. I've got a background in mental health as a mental health service user myself, and then having a career in mental health, culminating in setting up my own charity supporting people with mental health issues to access nature connection for their well-being.
Thank you, Julie, and hi everyone. So we're going to be very quickly, we're going to just tell you what patient and public involvement is, and I'm sure lots of you on this call know already what it is, but just bear in mind that there'll be people on this call that it'll probably be quite a new thing for them. We're going to talk about why we do it and why the NIHR thinks it's important. And Julie has got the hardest part of giving out some top tips around patient and public involvement. And of course, we would advise anybody doing patient and public involvement to have a word with their local RDS who can give them sort of top advice about getting patient and public involvement or service user involvement, as it's often referred to in social care, into their research proposal. So what do we mean by patient public involvement? Well, it's quite simply, it's research that's being carried out with or by members of the public rather than to, about or for them. So this would be, for example, members of the public sitting on steering committees, helping researchers to design research instruments, and indeed perhaps involved in actually developing research proposals. So no data is being collected from them. That's distinct from participation. And this is where people actually take part in research studies. So this is where members of the public will fill in a questionnaire, or you might interview them, do a focus group with them, etc. And so, of course, we're talking about involvement here. Now, one way, there's various approaches to involving members of the public in your research, and I've listed a few here. And one way I think of distinguishing between them is the amount of power or the amount of influence, if you will, the public members would have in decision making. So if we just go through these each of the stages. So consultation, for example, this is where you might perhaps be developing a research questionnaire, and you might ask members of the public their views on your questionnaire. And you're consulting with them. But of course, there's no real shift in power, is there? Because of course, that would be up to the researcher whether or not they took on board the comments from the members of the public. We then, if we move along, if you like, we've got collaboration and co-production, and we don't have time to go into depth about the differences there, but let's just accept the more collaborative approaches. And here, it's much more of a partnership between service users, members of the public, and indeed the researchers. So if we take the development of our questionnaire as an example, here members of the public, they would actually be involved working with the researchers develop that questionnaire. Their voice would carry weight. So it wouldn't be a case of the research just asking members of the public what their view was. They would actually have to kind of negotiate that. It's much more of a partnership. So there's a real shift in power in decision making. And of course, in the real world, when doing research, sometimes actually it is, it's a partnership between perhaps a group that represents service users and researchers. And so it's a much more collaborative approach. And finally, of course, we have service user controlled or patient-led research. It's often referred to in healthcare. And this is where often organizations that represent perhaps particular service users actually take the lead in the research. And it might be them actually inviting researchers to help them with their research proposals. In practice, of course, there's blurred boundaries between each of these approaches. And of course, you can combine different approaches. So it might well be that you perhaps want to collaborate on development of a research proposal. But it might be, as you're developing your research instruments, that perhaps you want to consult another group of members of the public on the development of those instruments. So it's not a case of either or. You can combine these approaches. But I do think this is quite a useful analytical tool to help you think about the public involvement that you are going to have in your research. And I do think that's important in terms of getting clarity and managing expectations as you go along. And I think Julie's going to talk about that a little bit more when we talk about tips on public involvement. So that's about what it is, but kind of why do we do it? Why is it important? Well, obviously, members of the public, people that use services, they're going to have a different perspective from that of the researchers and perhaps other professionals involved in the research. Because members of the public, of course, and service users are going to have expertise. They're going to have like the lived experience of actually using services, or perhaps taking medication. And they're going to know the impact of any changes in that medication or in those services, the impact that might have, for example, on their quality of life. And I think that lived experience can be used to improve the relevance and indeed the quality of research. So it can make sure that research focuses on issues of relevance to members of the public, to service users, rather than just what researchers and professionals think is important. And of course, it can be used to improve the quality of the research. So for example, to make the research instruments more sensitive, make sure the questions in a questionnaire are more relevant, that the length of the questions is appropriate, that people can understand what the questions are. And of course, this goes right through your research. So obviously including your recruitment procedures and documentation as well. So that's about relevance and quality. A second reason, and this is a personal view, is the one that's most important to me, is the moral imperative. And it's simply that I think service users, members of the public, should be involved in research and decisions that are likely to impact upon them. Quite simple for me. But there is a third one if you can't embrace either of those two, and it may be that you can't. And it's simply that if you want funding from the National Institute for Health Research, you have to do it. Or it's very, very unlikely that you will receive funding for your research. And there will be members of the public who will be on funding panels and committees who will be actually specifically looking at the patient and public involvement plans that you have in your research proposal. So that's me. So it's Julie for the hard part of the presentation. So over to you, Julie.
Thanks, Gary. I'll try and be quick. I know we're short of time. Yeah, look, Laura's presentation at the beginning of this session stressed the importance of meaningful public involvement from as early as possible, and David and Ned also talked about that. And I think it's really important to think about who your research will benefit, and right from the start sort of get relevant members of the public involved, and to be creative about where you find those people. Make sure you think about diversity and inclusivity when you're getting people involved as well. Accessibility. So yeah, look at barriers, potential barriers to involvement. Think really carefully about the location, the timing, the frequency of meetings, availability of transport, parking, etc. Do people have disabilities, caring responsibilities, work responsibilities that you need to factor in so that meetings and involvement can be accessible? And also things like being sensitive around issues such as limited attention span or energy, and just sort of making that environment welcoming to people. It might not be an environment that they're used to operating in. Make sure you provide clear information written in layperson's terms, but most importantly, ask people, all the way through, ask people how they feel that their voice can best be heard, what makes them feel respected and comfortable in the environment, what gives them confidence to contribute in a meaningful fashion. Resourcing patient and public involvement. So obviously, as has been mentioned before, a realistic budget think about payment for time spent for people that are involved, travel, carers, and make that information available to people that are getting involved right from the start, so they know what's expected of them and what they'll receive in return. It can also be helpful to have a named and experienced person responsible for public involvement, but as David Abbott said in his presentation earlier, it may not necessarily be the way that it works in social care research. And, you know, if it's a co-production approach, a collaboration across the research, obviously that's brilliant. Training and support. So yeah, give some thought to what training people might benefit from. They don't need to be experts in research, but they may need some context. They might need some specific training about aspects of the research that you want them to help with, or it may simply be to sort of build their skills and confidence so that they can support you well. Always ensure that you have more than one member of the public in any group. We see bids come through to review where they said, yes, we'll have a named layperson. It's really important to make sure that you feel an integral part of the team, that it's not just you and professional researchers on the other side, as it were. Because in terms of sort of acknowledging expertise of the patient and public, there can be a real assumption, unfortunately still, that professional or research knowledge is superior in some way to knowledge acquired by lived experience of a condition or service. And, you know, they're different, obviously, but equally as important for positive research outcomes. And ensure that input from public contributors is given equal status. That you do have sort of specific times that they can input in the same way as the rest of the research team. And I love that David Abbott sort of said, you know, 2 lay members on an advisory group that meets twice a year just isn't best practice anymore. And that Mark in his presentation said public involvement worked so well in his study that it didn't even feel separate. It just felt an integral part of the research. It's really important to be clear about why you're involving people, what value or expertise do they bring, what roles will they have. It's really frustrating if you feel that you're just a token element and your involvement hasn't been thought through. And of course, now we have the UK standards for public involvement, an excellent framework for what good involvement in research looks like. And the 5 standards cover communication, governance, impact, inclusive opportunity, support, and learning, working together. And really they're rules, they're not rules, rather, they're guidance rather than rules. You know, they're a useful tool to help you design, monitor and review public involvement. I think from a personal perspective, one of the people in sort of a forerunner of co-production, good co-production, is a woman called Ros Davies, and she says when people feel truly valued, incredible things happen. And I think that that's the most important top tip. Create an environment that makes people feel genuinely valued, and everything else will flow from that.
Julie, sorry to interrupt you. Or have you finished?
I've done.
Oh, great. Many thanks. Many thanks to Julie and also to Gary for who had the last slot, but not the least important, I would add. So are there any questions either in the chat or right now? And we have just a few minutes left, I'm sorry to say, but are there any final questions or maybe anybody who would like to comment from the group of speakers, something which they think may be important to convey to the audience?
If we have time, there's a question in the chat for Julie. The question is around attracting members of the public to be interested in being involved in research. Do you have any thoughts or advice in how to make that connection and engage with people?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, sort of look within yourself and see what it is that you want that member of the public to be involved for. What is your sort of genuine reason for involving them? And when you come from that place where you're really sort of valuing somebody's input, you're genuinely interested in what they have to offer, that's you know, that's something that's really attractive. And at the same time, you know, payments is a big issue, isn't it? And it's a thorny issue, but there's a lot of advice out there now on how to do this well. And I think it's so important to make sure that the lay people in your team feel that they're being adequately reimbursed for the important work that they're doing.
There is another question or a point. If an NHS organization is the lead organization to do successful applications, attract research capability funding in the same way as other NIHR funding does. Maybe this is a question for Laura, possibly, or?
I'm afraid I don't know off the top of my head. Just this isn't something that it might be something to talk to CRN about, unless Rifat has unmuted because she knows.
Yeah, well, because we don't get a lot of NHS organization as the lead, we get a lot of universities, but in principle, that should be the case, that if it is the NHS organization, so the capability funding, the project should be eligible for the capability funding. But Mark, I will come back to you with more detail on this, because this is an interesting, and in my mind, I know that there was some discussions going on, but I'll definitely come to you. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.